Welcome to What Is It About the Weather, where once a week we get together and explore the many ways that weather intertwines itself into our everyday lives. Sometimes they're pretty obvious, sometimes they're a bit more subtle. I'm your host, Mark Jelinek, and this week we're going to be talking about good old Aristotle. That's right, he hadn't been around for a while. Probably heard his name. Did you know he was really big into weather? Wrote books on it. Books! Well, books is a kind of a interesting way to phrase it. In any case, we'll get into that in a minute. Tried a little different setup here with the recording today. You guys can let me know if it works out all right or if I need to go back to the other setup. Trying a different type of filter for the microphone that I don't know if it's going to be as good for the pop reduction. I hope it is. So that I can continue to use it, but you let me know. Visually, the setup gives me a little more room to see things on the screen, which I think would be a good thing for certain episodes. Some don't matter. Some I'm kind of just sitting there with a small set of notes and going forward. Sometimes I think it'd be good to be able to reference a few more things on the screen. So just trying some new stuff. Hope you've had an interesting, maybe even a relaxing weather week. With all the stuff going on this year, this last couple of months with so many high-profile weather events, it's been exhausting for some, I know. Yeah, I was at that meeting with a bunch of other meteorologists, and of course, you always get a little overload then. But it's been. I guess people are just sort of glad maybe that the North Atlantic season looks like it's hurricane-wise is going to wind down some. Certainly not going to be as active. By no means are we at the end of the season, but it looks like we're going to get a little bit of a break. Some of the other things, that we've been watching around the globe seem to have eased off a little bit. Maybe it's because we're in change of seasons in the Northern Hemisphere. Although sometimes, that ramps up more severe weather, at least in the spring. Here in the U.S., it tends to. But, okay, so as you know, us meteorologists tend to look at the seasons a little differently, have these nice month-to-month sort of things, right? But we also kind of get into summer or end of summer a little sooner than the astronomical summer ending, fall season thing. But that one has come and gone too. However, despite it being fall in both capacities where I am, summer seemed to kick back in this week. It's been warm. And I do wonder sometime, maybe there's been a study on it, is how we respond when we think it's going to one season and then all of a sudden it becomes another. I mean, you see it sometimes, certainly with plant life, right? A late season freeze can hurt plants. And you even see it sometimes, I know we've seen it around here in the past couple of years where we've had milder winters, or you experience something like this where maybe leaves start to fall off trees or plants that, it happens every year, and maybe the cooling started, plants start going through that behavior, then all of a sudden it gets warm again and they get a little confused. And I do wonder if my human body is experiencing some of that. Now, I've been dealing with it okay. It's not a huge thing, but I do notice that the way I respond, you think you're moving to this other season and you get that bit of a jolt, then it kind of throws you off a bit. Maybe you have to think a little differently than you would have otherwise. Maybe I don't know. It's curious. Maybe change the sleep cycle or something a little bit. Any case, not a big deal. I'll survive. Looks like it's going to get a little closer to normal over the weekend and into next week. And there's always some ups and downs, aren't there? I like fall, though. So I'm looking forward to fall. For those that, I guess there's a lot of places where fall is an interesting time of year. It's the end of the harvest season. Certain crops that maybe have a longer growing season, you finally get the fresh versions as fall approaches. But I've grown up in an area where fall is, it's just, there's certain activities going on. whether it's sports that are being played, whether it's certain festivals that happen this time of year, whatever it might be. It's just a season, part of this time of year I guess I enjoy. So I'm glad fall's here. And maybe this time it'll stick around for a little while longer. The other thing weather-wise this week, and I guess it's not exactly weather. It's kind of sciencey, though. And because I'm teaching this radar satellite class, I also, keep an eye on this kind of stuff. So, I don't know, maybe because people I know that are in the weather have been writing about this topic. So I know that there's people out there that put forward the idea that the earth is flat. But I've also seen a lot of people leverage it as a marketing ploy. And I think we've come across that situation again where there's somebody, and I'm not going to, by me putting their name out there, it just pushes the story on. So I want to push it on in a broad context because I think it even led into this week's story a little bit. But people, it's like clicking links at the bottom of the page that are going to take you to stuff that you didn't want to see to begin with. And it's the same thing with this story. Just let it go. Let it go. Move on. Don't Google it. I know half of you are still going to Google it anyways. Don't Google it. Don't give the person any more publicity because that's all they're getting out of this. That's all they're getting. Whatever they claim their intent was never their intent. They're not serious about this. They are using it to get your eyeballs on them. And again, I've seen all the major media outlets cover this, right? And this person doesn't believe what they're saying. And if you listen to anything that he's recorded on it, you know that it's not because he uses words that counteract what he's even proposing. So just let it go. Let this person fall back into the oblivion they were in. Don't give them any money, whatever it is. Hey, it's crazy things. I know sometimes this stuff is entertaining. I really do get that. I recognize that sometimes we just like to be entertained. But what we're providing for here is an outlet for somebody whose relevance was not there otherwise. And when they literally start asking people for money, which this person is doing, thankfully they haven't gotten much yet. Come on. Go watch a boring sitcom that we know is not true, since life's not that way. Any case, let's talk about old Aristotle. I needed a little lighter topic, so we're going to dive into Aristotle, and I'm also going to try to keep the episode a little shorter this week. I know the last couple episodes I don't know that they've been long, but they've been longer than normal. So I wanted to pick a little lighter topic, maybe something that was more on the entertaining side than it was on the informative side. Not that I don't like to help share good things with you guys, but sometimes it's good to lighten up a little bit. I don't know, maybe we should do a session of lighter episodes because it's easy to get burdened with stuff. Sometimes the weather stuff could be that way, as you guys know. So let's dive into one of the earliest weather people we're aware of, Aristotle. And you're saying, Aristotle? I mean, I know the name. He did all his philosophizing stuff. But what's it got to do with weather? Well, I don't know, it's been, let's say, not quite 2,500 years ago, he wrote some books. Back in his day, if you were writing, you were getting some attention. Maybe he was doing a GoFundMe campaign. I do often wonder how philosophers made money. And I'm sure there were a variety of ways they did it. But Aristotle was pretty prolific. I mean, he's written on a bunch of topics. But he did actually literally write a set of books. It's 4 volumes, and again I use the word books loosely. I don't know the exact number of pages, but by today's standards you might argue that they're 4 longer chapters in a bigger book. Now, I have no idea how this would actually be pronounced, and I'm going to put more of a Spanish spin on it since it's more of a Mediterranean area. But Meteorologica, okay, Meteorologica. I think that's the original verbiage. I mean, in English we would call that meteorology by today's standards. But he put together these books, right? And it does get into more than just what we would call meteorology stuff by today's standards. But just imagine, I think it was, the 300s BC. So like I said, not quite 2,500 years ago, but it's been a clip, right? It's been a clip. And he put forward a lot of theories. Now, he even acknowledges in the book that it's also kind of a collection of the time. And I think that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind with certain authors in this day. And he is one of them, and he kind of acknowledges this, that he's in some ways collecting what other people were saying as well. However, even in this book, he tries to come up with his own theories that build upon things that he doesn't necessarily believe in and references some of those other people. So, he at least gives them credit, which is a good thing. But he got some things really right. That hot air rises. And interestingly enough, that things can happen that you don't necessarily witness. Just because you don't see it doesn't disprove or feel it. I mean, he talks about the senses. If you don't experience it, doesn't mean it can't happen. And he had an exceptional appreciation of the winds. Again, not, maybe didn't get all the nuances right, but talked about, and they get into a lot of things about how winds coming from different directions result in different things. But you've also got to use his frame of reference and where he sat. But generally speaking, there are a lot of things that he had a good basis for that made some sense. But for 2,000 years, essentially, what Aristotle said was accepted as truth. For roughly 2,000 years. Now, that's not true everywhere. I read an interesting follow-up about his theories and how that they were, reflected upon, used in, like, Great Britain, areas like that. And maybe not as much, but that may have just had to do with sphere of influence. I think realistically, Aristotle, like many people at the time, were focused on what their experiences told him. Now, he was kind of in this naturalist phase, so he tended to put things more with a biological twist to them. I mean, at its core, in some ways. But anybody in that time that lived for a long time in an area would come to know certain behaviors. And we've talked about weather lore before. That's where a lot of weather lore comes from. Some of it's valid, but maybe only valid in a certain region because that's just what happens there. If you live in a coastal area, how your weather behaves might be very different than somebody living in the mountains. So there were some slight flaws with Aristotle's theory. Now, he prescribed to the earth, wind, fire, air kind of theory. So the earth was in the middle, and we were surrounded by water, which was surrounded by air, which was surrounded by fire. Again, though, that was based on their experiences. And you think about things entering the atmosphere from above, a shooting star or anything like that, caught on fire, right? So there's some logic behind it. But, that didn't necessarily work out with all the theories. So like I said, he got some things really right. The concept of hot air rising was very interesting, and he did kind of get that right. Now, the problem was sometimes that didn't necessarily fit his theory, so he had to tweak it a little bit to have it make sense. So at its core, he might have gotten it right, but he didn't necessarily understand what happened above. Now, I've heard some people say, well, he used to talk about how air would get hotter as it rose, and I'm guessing getting to the idea that it was getting up to this area of fire, but he also recognized that as it got further away from the influence of the sun, as it rose, it would cool. So he did appreciate that, and as we all know, as you go up through layers of the atmosphere, you kind of go back and forth between areas that cool as the air rises, the part we live in, the troposphere, but then there are areas where the air warms again as it rises. I shouldn't say as it rises. As we go up in elevation, air generally gets warmer in certain places. Again, as we get in the stratosphere and beyond, if you ever want to, I guess I could put a link in the show notes to a standard temperature profile of the Earth atmosphere, just to give you a sense if you're not familiar with it, because that would be the right thing for me to do. But as you go through, you get these different things, and that would be it's a good basis of, again, it's a rough thing. It's what we know, but we get so caught up sometimes in what we see in our surface that we lose sight of the fact that the Earth does behave a little differently as you go up. But he kind of had a grasp for certain things like that. Now, like I said, though, having this whole idea that, it was the earth, water, fire, and air in there in the middle. But he also recognized so they would mix. And that was part of the trick, right? By mixing, he could explain some things that didn't make sense otherwise. But if you're working with those four basic things, and that's the way you base all your arguments or beliefs or understandings, you get to end up with some quirky things. As an example, nothing could live around the equator or in the tropics. Now, around where he was, that made a lot of sense because we had some of the dry deserts of northern Africa, that sort of thing. But as we also know, depending on where you are on the globe, living in that region is very feasible, especially if you're in areas that are heavily influenced by oceans. He would propose that fire, from that fire zone that was at the top, by the way, it did literally go earth, water, air, and then fire. So fire and air would mix to create heat waves. It seems logical to me at the time. And I could understand why he would come up with that idea. That thunder was actually the thing that caused lightning, not the other way around. And it was caused by, well, it's kind of hard to explain. So he had this idea that there were two types of air. There was moist air and there was dry air. And that when the two mixed, they created different behaviors. So generally speaking, they were their own things. Now, we do know you get areas of dry air or drier air that sometimes mix with areas of moister air. But we also know that they're not exclusive events, right? They don't magically, you don't go from dry air to moist air. It's not how it works. But what would happen is this drier air would get trapped in the moist air and would get pushed out by the moist air, if you would. And that's what caused the lightning. You had to deal with things like he tried to determine if air had weight by capturing air in a bag and seeing if the bag then weighed more. And as we all know, there's these nuances to things. And this gets into the whole challenge with Aristotle. So he was doing all these things, but he had no way to measure a lot of what he was trying to do. He didn't have the instrumentation that would eventually be what changed everything. So as we would get to the 1700s, late 1600s, 1700s, that's really when meteorology started to change again, because we were finally able to measure things like atmospheric pressure and temperature. And that was quintessential to our understanding of what was really going on. So for 2,000 years, though, we would believe a heat wave came from the fire layer mixing with the air layer to create a heat wave. Or that clouds could not rise above the tallest mountains. Again, not a lot of people living above the tallest mountains, right? And that hail, it was interesting. He had this whole idea about how hail forms. And again, at moments when you're reading, if you ever read this stuff, and I will put a link into an English translation. Keep in mind with translations, there's always some nuances that get missed. But he was trying to, and kind of got the idea of how raindrops would water droplets would come together to form bigger raindrops and things like that. There was some logic in it. But the whole idea, so his theory was that the bigger the hail, the closer to the earth that it formed. And his reasoning was as follows, because if it formed higher up, or if it was hail from higher in the sky, it would be worn down by the time it got to the planet. Because he had challenges with this whole how fast things fall and the weight of items, and didn't quite understand all those concepts, and didn't realize actually for a hailstone to get big, it needed to really be tossed back up in the atmosphere for it to continue to allow it to grow. But again, he had no idea what was going up in the clouds. There was no baseline for him. But again, for 2,000 years, that's what we thought. Yeah, there were some modifications. Yeah, there was some, I don't know, local beliefs, as you would, that maybe people ignored or said, well, that's not how our thing is. But in the context of things, given the day and given the belief that, it was earth, water, air, and fire, and that was a commonly held belief, and trying to make everything fit that theory, I think he did a reasonable job with it. Couldn't measure anything, but brought together lots of people thinking about this stuff for a long time. But I think it also shows that this is not a new thing. I mean, this demonstrates how weather really did impact lives. I mean, there was somebody back then doing a "What is about the weather" oration. They would go to the debate center there, hang out, pontificate, tell all his peeps about how the weather was and how it was going to impact them, and even try to do, it's funny, I still look back, seasonal forecasting, not necessarily trying to even do a week ahead, but seasonal forecasting's been a thing that's been around a long time because people wanted to try to plan. And he was just one of the first that was well known for doing it and put it down in something that would be recorded for all time. So I doubt he was the only meteorologist. But again, you got a pen and you're able to put it on paper back then. That was a big deal. It was a big deal. So, I look at all this stuff and so here's what really happened is you had that whole phase take place. And then the changes would come as we got instrumentation. And then we started to recognize the large-scale behavior, that weather wasn't just local, that somehow it was attached on this larger scale. And that really only took place, started taking place 150 years ago or so. And then we really started to understand the 3D nature, right? That we were just as dependent on what was going up in the atmosphere. And even today, modern meteorologists tend to look at some levels that are in the middle of the atmosphere to understand what's coming, because we recognize the role that plays in steering things around the planet. But we wouldn't understand that until we were really able to see 3D and be able to estimate what was going on in that 3D zone. We've gotten better at it, but even when we could in the beginning, getting a sense of what was going on above us. And then, of course, computers. That would change it all. And we've talked about the role of technology, right? So would Aristotle, what would he have thought? It's like going back and seeing some movie where people travel in time, like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, right? And they go back and they bring people forward in time. And how they would see things knowing all these differences that exist. But then you got to look and say, okay, are we going in reverse? I could not believe that, there was a lot of things that came together. Like I said, I wanted to do a little lighter episode, so I thought, well, we'll do this Aristotle stuff. And then that whole flat earth thing happened, which, kind of leads into this stuff. It's kind of like, making decisions with, it doesn't matter. But I was stunned this week. Made me think maybe we're returning to a time of Aristotle. Because like I said, Aristotle had some interesting things about thunder and lightning and clouds and how clouds would fall onto each other sort of thing. And I was looking at an Amazon Echo. And it said to ask the person's name. Not going to say it here because I know that triggers those echo things. How rain forms. So I did. And I was stunned at the answer. That rain forms when clouds get too heavy and can't hold it anymore. Now, I'm hoping that they just linked to a bad site. And I had to ask again to confirm that. And I even asked how snow formed, and I don't know what else, if I asked how lightning formed, or I don't remember. I started getting these other questions. The other answers were at least a little more in line. But this hit me that, it referenced something bad, or maybe somebody was having a little fun. I don't know. But that's how things like people talking about flat earths get out there, right? You hear it, gets ingrained in you, and you start to think, well, I heard it, must be true. Trust me, everything you read and see is not true. And I think most of the time there's no malice involved. I saw a fairly prominent website that I know, and that I reference sometimes with weather information, that had something completely wrong. I did a lecture this week about tornadoes, about how we see tornadoes with radar and whatnot. And their classification, what a tornado was just wrong. It's just wrong. And that's baffling to me, how that happens. And, something doesn't get checked or something doesn't get looked at properly. But I think in this day and age where everything's in a quick, need it now, that sort of stuff, that if we don't take the time to challenge the stuff, and that's why it is important to challenge things. Critical thinking. So I don't know. If you ever learned something growing up, and this is more about weather lore as much as it is anything else. Have you ever learned something, and it doesn't even have to be weather. Did you learn something growing up that, in theory, fell into the world of science? I mean, weather would be great. But did you ever learn something that you just came to know later that was just not true, not even close? And it can be medical as well. I know a lot of times, it's like what Big Fat Greek Wedding, where the guy treats everything with Windex. And it's kind of humorous, but we learn these things and they get entrenched in us. And I don't think no one's, again, trying to do it wrong. One person learns something, the next generation then learns it. And that's kind of what happened with Aristotle. And it takes a lot of effort to unwind those things, to disassemble and kind of reassemble the way we think. And I think that's sometimes why our advancement can be both hindered and benefit from that, because it does leave us, we tend to question a lot, and that's a good thing. It's a healthy thing. And I guess I wish we lived in an environment currently where thinking out loud wasn't discouraged, but it was recognized for thinking out loud, right? Because we need to grow. But let me know if you had something that you learned as a kid, particularly in your formidable years, that you came to know that just was not accurate. Let me know. What is it about the weather at gmail.com? What is it about the weather.com/contact? Now, I brought up this, this stuff about the social media and us questioning things and all that stuff. But that's important, right? Don't lose sight of that. That's how we expand. And I like when people, here's the bigger problem. Most of us don't like to be criticized. And I do think we have this challenge currently where we fall into this mix of tending to do that. We tell people they're dumb or stupid. And I even remember one of those things I grew up as a kid that I think is a good thing. Using the word dumb or stupid or calling people that is it's not a good thing. Because you don't want to be called that either. But we all say dumb and stupid things. So sometimes you gotta have to deal with that balance. Any case, continue to get some good, interesting questions. I did have somebody ask me about the Irma forecast. Not so much what happened near me, but in general, there was some talk about tropical cyclone forecast, hurricane forecast, when it had to do with this thing in Florida, where the forecast seemed to shift from one side of Florida to the other. And I think shifting is a strong word. When we look further out, we've talked about this before, you have a little more uncertainty, sometimes even more uncertainty than other times. in the forecast. And I think what people need to recognize with a place like Florida and where the hurricane did go is we are still only talking about tens of miles, not even necessarily hundreds of miles that the forecast changed, so tens of miles. And it can have a really big impact, and that's always a challenge, right? There are going to be cases where something moves by just 50 miles, and the ramifications are huge. But on a planetary scale, that's just a little bit. So it's important to recognize that that's always going to happen to some extent. We see this with winter forecast too, where what is rain versus what is snow changes a little bit. But that's also why it's important to keep that in mind when you're watching the forecast and looking maybe where you fall on the zone of where something is being forecasted to go. Because if you're kind of in the zone that looks to be close to wherever that borderline is, recognize that your forecast may just change. Sometimes they change big. Usually they don't, though, and a lot of times as we get closer to something happening. But recognize that, well, what would happen if it goes here or here? Okay, some very different outcomes for me. And just know that. Don't get worked up about it. No one needs to be called dumb or stupid. And we're going to get into, like I said, we're going to start talking about the technology behind things and kind of walk through a series. And we're going to start that in October. And like I said, I'm going to try to do it over a few episodes. I don't want to overload anybody. But maybe it'll help you understand or appreciate a little more why there's still these uncertainties and nuances that are, even if you like your deterministic forecast, which I tell you should think probabilistically, but even that word sometimes can scare people off. And I get that. I understand that. But just know that everything's not fixed. Not everything's fixed. All right. Had another question as well about, so in my opinion, were those Irma forecasts, were they good? I think they were pretty exceptional. Because even though there was some variance, it was still a pretty tight zone in which it was forecast to move, and it did move within that zone. And anytime an event like a hurricane makes a turn like that, to get the timing and the general turn right, that's an important piece, and it did that very well. Other question was more about the podcast itself, and I realize I'm starting to run long now, so let's hit it quick. I was going to keep it short this week. Somebody asked me about the Patreon stuff and just how the whole thing setup works. And I just want to say that Patreon does a good job of making sure that the people who are being supported get what you pledge to them. And they've actually made a change recently where they put a fee on top of it so that most of the money gets to the person that you're trying to support. So if you've been thinking about doing the Patreon, whether it's for this podcast and or others, and that's the other thing to keep in mind, if you're listening to multiple podcasts and they use Patreon, it's still the best platform that podcasters have currently to have folks support them. It's easy to do. And you get, even if you support 4 or 5 or 10 different things, you just get a bill kind of once a month that brings all that together. And do know that the majority of the money gets to the people that it's supposed to get to. All right. Well, now that I've run almost as long as I have in previous weeks, we'll let you go and get on with your weather intertwined week. Because as we all know, there's much more to weather than the weather itself.
There's your 2 White Sofa production.
We're tired of hearing our uncle grovel, so please support him on patreon.com/weather.